Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. Now today we go back to ancient Egypt for the first time in several episodes. The last time we were here, we told the story of Thutmose III's victory over the Canaanites at the Battle of Megiddo around 1457 BCE. And today it's almost 200 years later. Thutmose III is long dead. And Ramses II is pharaoh, and he's about to have words with a tribe that's been interrupting shipping all around the eastern Mediterranean, the Sherden pirates. So we haven't talked much about sea travel in the late Bronze Age, or what kinds of ships they might have had, or what naval warfare would have looked like. So let's take a look at that now. Now, as ocean climates go, the Mediterranean is pretty mild. It's mostly protected from the kind of high winds and storms that are common in the Atlantic and Pacific and Indian Oceans. But it's also surrounded by land, much of it highly productive and capable of supporting large populations of people, which means cultures could develop in lots of small regions, and if they needed something from outside their region or they outgrew their environment, they didn't have to go far to find a new, more hospitable place. Which means they didn't need to develop new ways of traveling long distances. Which means the people of the Mediterranean were far from the first people to develop sea travel. I don't think we actually know who was first, actually, but we do know people had already expanded across the Pacific, settling Indonesia, the Philippines, and even Australia way back in the Paleolithic, 40,000 years ago or so. We don't really understand how they did it, but they did. And they left evidence behind for archaeologists to find. But they never made it to the Mediterranean, and probably not even close. No, the seafaring cultures of the Mediterranean got there on their own. So we've already looked at two cultures that grew up in river valleys, the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians. The Egyptians in particular were very much a river culture, even orienting their geography in terms of upstream and downstream on the Nile, instead of north and south like we do these days. Which makes it a little challenging when we talk about Egypt, because downstream or lower Egypt is actually the northern part of the culture. So it's not that surprising to learn that the Egyptians were one of the first seafaring peoples in the Mediterranean. Not the first, because islands like Sicily and Sardinia were settled around 10,000 years ago, and Crete was settled by about 6500 BCE, and you can't get to those places without crossing the sea. But Egypt is the culture that left records we know how to read. So most of what we know about Bronze Age seafaring cultures comes from the Egyptians. And the Egyptians don't seem to have worried much about going to sea until the New Kingdom period, which started sometime around 1550 BCE. That's when the Egyptians started paying attention to what was going on outside the Nile Valley and Delta. And since traveling away from the Nile usually meant traveling through the desert, it made sense for them to learn how to travel across the water instead. But it takes a different kind of ship to travel up and down the Nile than it does to sail across the Med. See, on a river you don't need much more than a raft. The earliest Egyptian boats on the Nile were actually made out of bundles of papyrus reeds tied together. Add steering and oars and you can face most things that might come up on a river. But for the ocean, even for the Mediterranean, you're going to have a hard time in a reed boat. See, even small waves are more than you're likely to encounter on a river, unless you're going through rapids or whitewater, and to get through whitewater you need a small boat because the channel is small. But to navigate ocean waves you need a bigger boat because it's more stable. It needs to be stiffer, and it also helps to have higher walls, which are called gunnels or bulwarks on a boat, and a strong backbone called a keel, and a sail comes in handy as well. Well, that's all great if your culture comes from Southern Europe or the Levant, where you have plenty of building materials that are suitable for building a stiff-bodied ship with high gunnels and a strong spine and a mast. You know, trees. But Egypt, being in the middle of the Sahara, doesn't have that many trees. Which means in order to build seagoing ships, the Egyptians needed to get trees from other places. Or they needed to learn how to use the scrubby little trees they had. And it turns out they did both. Thanks to Thutmose III's expeditions up to Syria, they controlled a good piece of the Levantine coast and the cedar forest the people of Canaan and Syria used to build their ships. They probably also had access to timber from Central Africa thanks to their conquest in Nubia, up the Nile in modern-day Sudan. And they also figured out how to build ships basically out of Legos, fastening small planks together to form ships that looked like they'd been put together the same way they would have built walls out of bricks. Which works fine for the sides and the gunnels, but it doesn't solve the problem of the keel to stiffen the ship. So the Egyptians figured out how to stiffen it without a keel by using something called a rope truss. Now, I'm not a nautical engineer, and I don't really understand how a rope truss would work, but it looks like it stiffened the ship by putting tension on the Lego pieces and holding them tightly against each other. And whether I understand it or not, it seems like it worked. So what did they do with these ships? Mostly move stuff. Because it's almost always easier to move something heavy by water than by land. The Egyptians already knew that because they knew how to move stuff on the Nile. The biggest Egyptian ship we know about was built around 1500 BCE to carry 2 giant stone obelisks, each one weighing about 330 tons, down the Nile from the quarry to the temple they were supposed to be raised at. And of course it wasn't just stone that they moved. They could move timber or bronze or tin from the Levant to Egypt through the Med, or fruit or cattle from East Africa through the Red Sea, or grain from Egypt to someplace else, or anything you can think of that you might want to trade. Because anything you move over land has to be carried on a man's back, or a donkey's, or in a cart that an ox is pulling. And anything that's alive that you need to carry something heavy over land is something you have to feed and take care of. But you don't have to feed a ship. You have to take care of it for sure, but it's not going to starve if you can't find enough grain to keep it going. Plus it moves faster than an ox or a donkey. So boats are great for trade. And any boat you can use to move trade goods, with a few modifications, you can use the same boat to move soldiers. Thutmose III wasn't the first pharaoh to figure out how to move troops by ship, but he definitely pushed the idea forward. After he marched through the Sinai into the Levant a couple of times, he figured out that it would be much faster and not nearly as hard on his guys to move them by sea. So he used one of his 16 campaigns into the Levant and Syria to establish harbors on the coast, then used those harbors in his future campaigns to move more troops faster than he could moving over land. But in his time at least, moving troops and supplies was about all naval ships were doing. Ship-to-ship combat at sea seems to have been pretty rare until the 1200s BCE. That said, you know it was happening. Because if you want to take something that doesn't belong to you, like valuable trade goods, it's easiest to take it while it's traveling, while it's between fortified cities and garrisons and the things that can protect it. So I'm just going to guess that piracy started about 3 days after trade started moving by sea. But piracy is a much different animal from what naval warfare would become. Because when you attack a ship to steal its cargo, the last thing you want is for that ship to sink and take its cargo to the bottom with it. You don't mind so much if you have to kill the guys sailing it, but so much the better if you don't have to. And safer for your guys too. So you're going to more or less fight a land battle at sea. You're going to pull up next to your target, intimidate it into surrender if you can, board it, and take out its crew with archers and hand-to-hand fighting if you can't. And you defend against that by building bigger ships with bigger crews and taller bulwarks, making them harder to board. Or by sailing your trader ships in convoy with Navy ships escorting them. Navy ships whose job is to be big and scare pirates away, or board them and kill their crews if that doesn't work. Because in order to board a merchant ship, the pirates have to expose themselves to being boarded by the Navy ships. And for centuries, this is what naval combat must have looked like. Land battles at sea. A few centuries after Ramses II, warships would have bronze rams that allowed them to sink enemy ships by colliding with them. But we're not there yet. So land battles at sea is what Ramses had to work with. And of the major empires we've looked at so far, he had the biggest navy. So who was Ramses II? We talked about him a few months ago when we told the war story of the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE. But if you haven't seen that war story, here's a quick rundown. If you've heard of one Egyptian pharaoh, it's probably Tutankhamun. King Tut is famous because his tomb was undisturbed until archaeologists found it in 1922. Not because of anything he did, because he didn't do that much, but because the things we found in his tomb taught us a lot about ancient Egypt. But if you've heard of two pharaohs, the other one just might be Ramses II, because he had one of the longest reigns of any Egyptian pharaoh, or honestly of any world leader we have records for. He ruled for 66 years from around 1279 BCE to around 1213 BCE. And whatever part of his reign he didn't spend fighting, he spent the rest building stuff, mostly temples and monuments to himself. I mean, no point not letting future generations know how awesome he was. That would just be selfish. So by the time Ramses took the throne, he was no stranger to military campaigning. He'd been going to war with his father, Seti I, in Libya and Palestine since he was about 14 years old. And his first campaign as pharaoh may have been into Nubia right after he took the throne. And he probably took his own sons with him for that one. And in the second year of his rule, he turned his attention on the Sherden. So who were the Sherden? Well, they were one of the tribes we collectively call the Sea Peoples. And the Sea Peoples may have been the cause, or one of the causes, or a symptom of what we call the Bronze Age collapse, a shift that took place mostly in the 12th century BCE that saw most of the Bronze Age cultures fall to be replaced by Iron Age cultures. We're still almost 100 years from the collapse from this war story, but it's coming, and the Sea Peoples are going to be part of it. And the Srdn are the first of the Sea Peoples we're going to encounter. It's not clear where they came from originally, but in 1278 BCE they were living on the island of Sardinia, west of Italy. And as you might expect from an island people, they were accomplished seafarers. They probably traded with the Egyptians and the Phoenicians, a Canaanite tribe that would become important after the collapse, but in 1278 was just learning how to sail. And probably with the Hittites and with other cultures around the Mediterranean we don't know as much about. But Ramses knew them as pirates, because in addition to trading, they raided other people's trading ships, and probably kept what they wanted and sold some of the goods back to the people they had just stolen them from. It wasn't just the Egyptians they were stealing from, but when you have the biggest navy in the region, pirates become your problem. Because not only are you losing more ships to them than anybody else is, but you also have the most resources to throw at the problem. So, Ramses started throwing resources at the problem. No shit. There they were. The BS meter for this war story is 8 or 9 out of 10. I've had to make up most of the details. We have names and approximate dates, but not much else. So the normal way to deal with an enemy that's raiding your stuff in the Bronze Age would be to figure out where they were coming from and hit it with overwhelming force. Wipe them out at their base and you wouldn't have to worry about them anymore. But you can't always do that, either because they don't have a single base, or their base is protected by a powerful ally, or you don't know where it is, or it's out of your reach for some other reason. And when that happens, you have to go to plan B. Make it hurt enough that they stop. So the first part of plan B is what we talked about a little while ago. Escorts, big ships, land battles at sea. But when the pirates have a base that's out of your reach and now they have the resources they've taken from your shipping, they can build even bigger ships, making your job of protecting your ships that much harder. Not to mention your resources are spread across half a dozen critical efforts, trading in multiple directions and moving troops and goods on land and sea, and building cities and temples and monuments at home and in the places you're trying to keep hold of, while they can afford to focus their efforts on taking your ship. So you have the advantage everywhere else, but they have the advantage on the water. which means you either have to figure out how to overcome their advantage on the water, or you have to get them to fight you on land. Well, the Srdn were smart enough to know not to fight the Egyptians on land. So Ramses had to figure out how to overcome their advantage on the water, and to do it in such a way they wouldn't know they were screwed until he closed in on them. He had to figure out how to trap them so he could destroy them. Okay, so he didn't know where they were coming from, but he knew where they would be. They would come out of nowhere to hit his ships when he tried to move stuff across the Med. So he had to give them a big enough target that they would commit most of their ships to it, then spring his trap and squash them like a bug. Pretty simple concept. Except that he couldn't let the Srdn see the trap coming, at least until they had committed to their attack, which meant he couldn't just beef up the escort for the merchant fleet. But if the Srdn couldn't see the trap coming, how would the fleet know to attack? It's a pretty simple problem in the age of radio and encrypted satellite communications, but of course Ramses didn't have any of that. Hell, he didn't even have flares or rockets. The only options he had were signals his sailors could see or hear. And in the Mediterranean in 1278 BCE, that was nothing more sophisticated than drums and smoke and fire signals. As far as I can tell, he wouldn't even have had bells, which means his most effective signals would only reach 10 to 20 miles, and probably a lot less than that depending on the weather conditions. And of course, the farther away his ships were, the slower they would be joining the fight. So he needed to make his target irresistible. Easy enough. He promised one of his sisters to a Canaanite king, one who ruled a key trading town and who had managed to keep the port more or less free of pirates and other scum and villainy. And he let news of the betrothal get out, proclaiming throughout the Nile Delta and the Levant not only when she would be traveling, but just how happy he was with this king for being such a good, loyal vassal. In other words, I'm sending my sister to you, along with a whole bunch of gifts for your faithful service. In other words, there's going to be a metric shit ton of gold and treasure with this fleet, not to mention a royal sister you can ransom for even more gold and treasure. He made the Srdn an offer they couldn't refuse, and then he waited a couple of weeks so they would have time to get their ships in place, and then he launched his fleet. 20 cargo ships escorted by 5 warships, each one beautifully painted and decorated with the finest sails and rigging and the richest trappings. Hell, the ships alone probably would have been worth taking even without any treasure. But of course there was no treasure and no royal sister. Instead, the ships were loaded with rocks, heavy enough they would ride low in the water and go slow. The royal sister was a young widow plucked from a temple in Thebes and sent on this voyage with the promise that Pharaoh would make sure her kids were taken care of if anything happened to her. And each ship had double the normal number of sailors on it, all armed and ready for the Srdn to show up. And Ramses himself, swallowing his pride, stood on the deck of the lead ship, dressed as an ordinary sea captain, his crew forbidden from acting any differently toward him than they would toward their usual captain. And he had more ships, about 30 more, stationed at 6 ports along the Delta and up the Sinai coast. That way nobody had enough concentration to tip the pirates that something was going to go down. The plan was simple. The lead ship would burn a brazier, a metal basket full of coal with plenty of green wood added to it, so it would make a lot of smoke. Not terribly unusual. This was a high-profile convoy, and Ramses would want it to announce itself to every city it passed. So he ordered it to sail close to the shore, no more than 10 miles off, so they could all see the smoke. But when it passed each of the 6 Navy ports, the ships stationed there pushed off and followed, keeping between the fleet and the shore so the Srdn wouldn't see them when they attacked. Well, the Srdn took the bait. They fell on the convoy with 22 ships just as it passed Gaza. And Ramses sprung his trap. As soon as the Srdn's sails appeared on the horizon, the rest of the merchant ships lit their own braziers, adding smoke to the signal and adding just a little more confusion to the fight. Archers stationed themselves near their ships' braziers, ready to light fire arrows they could hopefully use to light Sherden's sails or even ships on fire. Because the Sherden had a little bit of a disadvantage here in that they didn't want to destroy their prizes, but the prizes had no such reservations about destroying them. And as the pirates closed on the convoy, the 30 trailing ships swung wide to approach them from behind. The pirates were used to easy scores, and they didn't have any captains willing to be left out of this haul anyway. So they hadn't left any ships out as flankers. So they had no warning as the Egyptian ships approached. Meanwhile, the poor bastards in the prize ships were fighting for their lives. It's not like the pirates came to play cards with them. They meant to board and either compel them to surrender or kill their crews, like we talked about. And except for the danger to their own crews, they didn't much care which. And against 22 ships, the 5 escorts didn't have much of a chance. But the archers did their job, setting fire to 2 ships' sails. The sailors managed to cut them free before either fire could spread to the deck, but they had to back away from the fleet to do it. But the Srdn had managed to close with no fewer than 10 of the merchant ships, including 2 Srdn ships against the leader. And if the fight was harder than they expected, they were still in a pretty good spot. The Srdn would pull alongside their target, pulling in their oars at the last second to keep from breaking them, maybe breaking the target's oars and taking out a few rowers if they couldn't get them in fast enough. Then they'd grab the target ship with hooks and ropes running planks across the gap for boarding. And while archers took shots at key personnel like the captain and the guys steering the ship and anybody with a weapon, the pirates swarmed across with these straight, heavy swords that looked a lot more like the medieval swords you're used to than the sickle swords the Egyptians used. Now, usually they would have left the oarsmen alone unless they tried to fight. These guys were mostly just poor bastards, slaves or the next thing to it, whose life wasn't going to be much different no matter who controlled the ship. And any oarsman they killed, they would just have to replace him with a dude from their own crew. So it just made sense to leave these guys off the hook if they could. But because it was a trap, these rowers were soldiers. They were trained to pull oars together, but they weren't the apathetic poor bastards the pirates were expecting. And when the pirates boarded, they dropped their oars, and they grabbed their swords, and they joined the fight. And that was probably the pirates' first clue that something was wrong. That and the fact that these ships were swarming with armed guys. And by the time they figured that out, the Egyptian warships were close enough that it was too late to do anything but get ready to fight. The Sherden ships were larger, but the Egyptians were more maneuverable, so they teamed up, 2 or 3 Egyptians swarming one Sherden ship. And once that one surrendered, they moved on to the next one. 5 ships ganged up on the 2 attacking the lead cargo ship, and between the reinforcements and the pirates finally figuring out what was happening, they gave in quickly. Of the 22 ships that closed with the convoy, only 2 escaped. The 2 that had lost their sails early in the fight and fallen behind. Of the rest, if we figure each pirate ship had a fighting crew of 40, that's about 800 guys. Since this is the age before warships could really sink each other, it's reasonable to imagine they would surrender rather than all fighting to the death. So figure 300 killed and wounded and 500 taken prisoner with their ships. And Ramses must have been impressed with the way they fought because he added them to his personal bodyguard. His Sherden guards rode with him to Kadesh 4 years later and fought with him on several other campaigns. And a few weeks after the fight, the Sherden king sailed to Thebes to make peace with the Egyptian pharaoh. The Sherden would attack no more of Ramses' ships as long as Ramses made sure they were marked as his. The Sherden would fight with him, adding 1,000 warriors to the ones he had already captured. In return, Egypt would share its grain with the Sherden and not try to figure out where they were sailing from. The Mediterranean was still far from a peaceful place, and it would get worse in the years after Ramses died. But for now, this war was at an end. And of course, because I had to make up this war story, there's no scorecard for this week. But that's Ramses II's victory over the Sherden pirates. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this war story, please give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to tell your friends about me. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.